Good morning, everybody. Danny has convinced me that a computer should have written my paper for sure, filled with biases and noise, no doubt. But basically, I'm the opening act of a series of papers today on the macroeconomic implications of the digital age and artificial intelligence specifically. And my basic point that I would like to argue is that it's macroeconomically important. It's very evident in the data for decades, and a lot more is to come. And the questions of what happens when machines replace workers is a very real and important question, not a fantasy, and it's not something for the future. It's something that's been underway for a long time. I think it's probably right to say in some sense that the modern high-income world economies, and especially the US economy, have been playing out the introduction of a general purpose technology of digital information for the last 60 years. And so we're watching a revolution that continues to unfold. And the revolution has not lost any steam. That's a mixed metaphor, I guess, in GPTs. It has not lost any bits or any depth. It's probably accelerating because of the ability of machines to substitute for very sophisticated work. And so I do believe in a kind of, not quite singularity necessarily, but an acceleration. And I think that it shows in the labor market. So I have three basic propositions. One is that machines can and do substitute for labor. Automation is a real phenomenon. It is obscured in the way we learn economics because the Cobb-Douglas production function in a solo growth model doesn't allow for it. So it takes some decades to overcome, for me at least, what I learned. But there are ways that are sensible to model automation, and it is a pervasive phenomenon. That's number one. Second, and very importantly, smart machines embody skilled labor in the form of R&D and direct expertise. So there is that complementarity of skills and technology that we observe and have talked about for decades, but it's not a kind of mysterious production function formalism that just happens to have the right kinds of partial derivatives. It comes from the fact that experts produce machines that substitute for labor. And those experts are therefore in demand because they produce a significant market value, and they displace a lot of labor. And then the third point that I think is important, and where there's a lot of expertise in the room and a lot of speculation about the future, is that the evolution of smart machines has followed a discernible path up until now. And now there's a big debate about what kind of path it will follow in the future. The general point that I think is correct is that machines have tended to be able to displace labor that have two qualities. One is relatively low skill activities at the beginning, so brute force activities and manual labor. And second is repetitive and predictable activities. And so the usual classification is along the lines of expertise or skill or cognition of some sort, but I'm sure that that's a very difficult axis to define in that way. And the other is repetitiveness. There too, I think it's a little bit difficult to define because It's not as if workflows come automatically in one form or another. We make workflows repetitive. And so we redesign our lives to work with the machines. And so it works in not a simple linear way. I read a book review of a new book. I don't know if the author's in the room, but it didn't make sense to me what was quoted, which is, it said, when will a smart machine be able to read the instructions on an IKEA box and assemble the furniture? And the answer that the author gives in this thing is, well, not in this century. And that's absurd, because IKEA is going to redo its instructions so that the machine can do it. It's going to be machine-readable design quite quickly, probably within 10 years or less, that you could redesign the instructions so that it is completely adaptable. But up until now, I would say machines have been able to replace relatively lower skilled kinds of activities. And now, as Danny said, I'm sure they're going to replace economists soon in many, many areas, and probably research in many areas, because I don't know about you, but I can't keep up with 5 journals, much less 50,000 journals, but machines won't have any problem doing that. So I think that we will find ourselves in a happy world where our work is being done for us by others, which sounds pretty good to me, actually. There's just a slight macro problem, which is I want to own the machine that does it. And so there's a little bit of income distributional question that we need to get clear. So we haven't seen this dramatically until recently, and the discussion in the profession has really only come intensively, I would say, in the last 15 years. Because up until the 1990s or so, Caldor's stylized facts and a labor-augmenting technological change solo model was still our working model in our heads. And it seemed to be just fine that productivity went up, wages went up, prosperity went up, and all good things went together. And if you're in a Cobb-Douglas world, all good things have to go together, basically, no matter where the productivity comes from. And that worked pretty well up until the beginning of this century. You might see a slight downtrend, and then many, many kinds of data show that productivity continued to rise and wages stagnated. And then we looked back and said, well, it's actually even a little more interesting than that, because certain classes of wages stagnated not just since 2000, but back to the 1970s, actually. And we all came to understand that high school graduates haven't had a real wage increase or real compensation increase for 40 years now. And so the story started to get richer and richer. And I would argue that what we have seen recently is a manifestation of automation, broadly speaking, and it's a manifestation of something that's been going on for a lot longer than the last 17 years, but it's been obscured by aggregation, essentially. So we have to disaggregate the economy, and it turns out both heuristically and statistically that there's a pretty good disaggregation, and a number of the papers use something like this. The goods producing sectors, agriculture, mining, construction, manufacturing, is a good aggregate. Construction's a little bit of an outlier because it's been harder to automate till now, but agriculture, mining, and manufacturing are the machine age par excellence, because a lot of what the machines do is both brute labor. They literally substitute for hand picking in agriculture or moving products through an assembly process in manufacturing. And they're pretty repetitive, or, as I said, you can redesign the workflow so that they are repetitive. I don't think anyone would have thought assembling an automobile as a repetitive activity before the assembly line made it a repetitive activity, so you redesign the workflow so that it becomes automatable in that sense. Then there are a series of basic business services that really, in a way, are ancillary to the goods producing sector. They're not really final demand sectors on their own. Wholesale trade, transport, warehousing, retail trade are how to get those goods to the market. And they have often a little bit higher level of expertise than in the production sphere. They have less predictability of activity, mainly because of the human interface. And that's the big barrier that's being overcome now. Machines did not talk to people effectively until 20 years ago or 25 years ago, and our first 10 years of talking to machines was a pain in the neck. And now we're used to it. Still is a bit of pain in the neck, but as Danny would say, less than talking to other people. The machines are a little bit more predictable. So that sector is very much linked to the goods sector. Personal services are typically low-skilled, and workflow is a little bit harder to handle. Now, professional services is the sphere of high-level expertise that writes the code, that develops and designs machinery. It's advanced engineering. It's advanced medical skills up until now, though all of these are subject themselves to eventual displacement. But typically, this has been very high expertise and very low workflow predictability. And government, I won't get into the philosophical argument about whether this is a high-skilled, low-skilled, predictable, or unpredictable activity, but I think it's actually almost completely automatable, definitely with less noise. But I'm not going to deal too much with e-governance right now. Now, if you disaggregate by these sectors, then you see some pretty striking differences. And the main point is that the labor share of income, which I believe can be thought of, and in a moment I'll argue it more formally, but can be thought of as an automation-induced phenomenon, has been underway pretty seriously for the last 30 years at least, and probably longer. I didn't have good, consistent national accounts data to draw on for that. But this is the goods producing sector, and several papers note the automotive sector, which has been replaced, where assembly line workers have been replaced by robots, but it's pretty pervasive, especially through the durable goods part of the manufacturing sector, and certainly in agriculture, where it's basically been almost completely mechanized, and we have no more coal miners, almost, because all of that is subject to almost complete automation. The red line is the basic business sector, trade, wholesale, trade, transport, and so on. And there's also a more gradual, less noted downtrend of the labor share of value-added at factor prices. The other sectors don't show that trend at all. And if anything, the professional sphere, which has been the fastest growing part of our economy over the last 50 years, is a very high labor share of value and even slightly rising. So when you aggregate this, you don't see this effect jumping out as sharply as I think it deserves to be noted. And my argument would be it's been this sector where smart machines have done their job up until now, and they're coming for these sectors now. So we can learn a lot about the implications of what's happened here for what's going to happen in the future? Well, one of the things, obviously, and that's quite obvious and important, is that if a certain class of labor is displaced, and it's basically been lower skilled labor, high school or less, say, now even some college is basically getting the same returns as high school. Until you get a bachelor's degree, there's really not even a break almost anymore in the data. There is, of course, a tremendous supply response, and one of the most important macro questions is how elastic is that supply response? And that's really a question of how educatable is a population. Are there underlying skills and cognitive limits and aptitudes that will earn long-term rents? Or is this all perfectly substitutable on the margin so that the extra year of schooling earns the same rate of return as basically any other asset in the end? We don't know the answer to that, but what we do know, and what I would argue, is that the dramatic structural change doesn't just show up in unemployment, first of all. That's the wrong place to look. Of course, unemployment has to do with the supply side. People want jobs, so they'll find jobs, even if they're very low wages. At very low end, it shows up as a withdrawal from the labor market and going onto the dole in some way. But the idea that what we're looking at with automation is the loss of jobs is a misunderstanding. We're looking at whether the labor demand curve is shifting in or out. In other words, what's happening to real incomes is the much more interesting question. But even that depends on the supply response of workers at different skill levels. So the other huge shift in our economy, of course, is the massive increase of educational investment, and which we undercount in multiple ways, because we don't count the opportunity costs. We don't even count it as investment, but this has been a huge transformation. And actually, yeah. So share of employment by education shows, I said that the low education, that's by standards in this room, is below a bachelor's degree. And that's declined from about 85% of the economy to about 65%, which is a big change over a 40-year period. And the share of earnings by education is obviously an even bigger change, because the wage gap between low-skilled and high-skilled workers widened as a result of these processes. What we see is that an initial steep widening narrows over time because of the lagged supply response of education. And in the end, whether it goes all the way to zero is basically the question: can everybody ultimately end up with a PhD, if that's what the market wage differential is indicating? So the basic idea that I think is helpful here is an increasingly well-treated idea that production is a series of tasks. The series of tasks are filled by occupations. The occupations typically require different aptitudes, skills, and training. And these different tasks have different degrees of susceptibility to automation. So in the simplest case, in the paper, which is still being written, there's a goods producing sector, and it has production and non-production tasks, so P and N. And it has buildings. So I say that buildings are complementary to labor, but machines are substitutable for labor. This is crude, but it is emphasizing the point that capital is not simply complementary to labor, as in a Cobb-Douglas production function. Certain kinds of capital are pure substitutes. So I say that the production side can be carried by labor or by machines. Similarly, the non-production activities, supervisory activities, can be carried by labor or by machines. but to be in the non-production part requires a higher level of skills. And the quality of the machines, which is given by a parameter here, that's the evolution of this technology. And typically, non-supervisory work up until recently has not been as susceptible to automation as production work. So in the simplest model, I say it's only production workers who are less educated workers who are vulnerable to automation. And then my aim, what I'm working on, is a parameterized computable general equilibrium model for the US economy, basically a one-digit SIC model that allows for this kind of substitution of different kinds of tasks over time, and recognizes that those don't fall from heaven as technological manna, but they require the inputs of the R&D sector. So there is a boom of the R&D sector in the US economy empirically, and consequentially for the distribution of income, because people with PhDs are the best paid people in the country, and they're producing the automation that is putting their counterparts out of high wage work. And that's the dynamic politically and from an income distribution part of the economy. If you simulate this kind of phenomenon, this is not to be taken seriously because the parameterization is not serious yet. But this is an example where there is the single parameter that is being studied here is basically the introduction of, I would call it a GPT, in the sense that the productivity of returns to R&D go up. And so there's a parameter that determines how productive R&D is. That's the only parameter. But it's designed so that as intellectual property rises, the first jobs that go are the more easily automated jobs, and over time, you capture more and more of the labor force. So the first effects of this are a boom of higher education, a boom of wages of engineers, and a loss of wages of those on the assembly line who continue to work, but at lower pay. That works out over time with a supply-side response on education, so that more of the economy becomes educated. The wages of unskilled, or the labor demand for unskilled workers continues to decline. The next step kicks in where a higher skilled cadre of workers faces automation. That starts the decline of their real wages. The labor share of income continues to fall, and so forth. What is the end point of a story like that? And I'll just conclude here. The end point of the story is that all of this is potentially welfare improving in the simple sense that the output capacity of the economy is expanding, but it's, of course, tremendously disruptive in terms of growing income inequality. And to get a Pareto improving design requires a significant and a growing amount of redistribution. So the bottom line of my story is that this process is underway. It's been underway in a significant sense for several decades, and we're probably in a period where it's coming after our jobs too. If we manage the distributional consequences of that, that will all be great, because while all of our computers have the next conference, we'll all be having a nice cup of coffee in the coffee shop next door. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me here to speak. I'm here to talk about education and AI. I'll respond a bit to Jeff's paper, but it arrived sufficiently late that it basically placed no constraints on my content whatsoever. So I appreciate that. But I read the broader set of papers, and I think what I'll talk about fits into the conference writ large. So, you know, the question, I study the economics of education, and I think an important question for what you're talking about in this room is, can we increase the number of highly skilled people using the education system? So a lot of what you're talking about all depends on us being able to create workers who know how to learn and who are not immediately made redundant by each improvement in technology. Otherwise, we're going to end up with this labor immiseration situation, highly unequal economy. You know, our classical model would be as the returns to skill and education go up, education rises as well, with the most academically able obtaining that advanced education. And in that world, we got nothing to worry about. So I'm going to tell you instead what world we're in. These are statistics from the census organized by year of birth of the share of the population that has obtained any college, and that's the red line, and has obtained a BA. And in my world, the NBER Economics of Education, we include this among the skilled folks. So now I'm even more depressed, right, because this is now being classified in your categorization as most of them being unskilled. Right? So you can see that number has risen considerably. We're up to probably more like 70% at this point, and this is of the entire cohort. So this is, you know, the net product of whether people finish high school and then go on to college. So this is driven not just by increases in college entry conditional on high school graduation, but increases in high school graduation. About 90% of the population graduates high school at this point. As you can see, the BA completion rate, and this is BA by your early 20s or so, has increased a lot less. And I'm showing this by birth cohort rather than for the entire economy, because this is essentially where any increases in education come from. Very few people return to school in their 30s or 40s. If we're going to see increases in education, it's going to come from birth cohorts coming through and increasing the education levels. So that might be more up to 29, 30, 32 at this point, but not much higher. Okay? And then within that, what you've been talking about as highly skilled, of course, is the graduate degrees. And that's an even smaller cut of this group. This just cuts the same thing by gender. So this is any college, and here we can see that it's women who have accounted for most of the recent increase in college attendance. And this is even starker when we look at the BA. So male BA attainment has been essentially flat for about 3 decades. So most of the action is coming from women. And obviously, if you're not completing a BA, you're not going on to get that postgraduate work either. So these are the numbers we're currently working with. BA is moving quite slowly, and that's what we've been talking about, and Jeff talks about as basically the middle skilled. The growth is also highly uneven. If you have in your mind that what's going on is basically the smartest kids are rising to the top, here's some statistics by income. So this is by your family income as a child. We're breaking the population up into 4 quartiles. This first, second, third, top quartile. This is those born in the early 60s. And then this is people born in the early 80s, and this is college attendance now. And you can see that college attendance has gone up across the board. 80%, again, this is unconditional on anything. This is just the entire population. Here's BA. So we've gone from 5% of the lowest income group getting a BA to 9%. And this is during the era, between these 2 periods, is when financial aid expanded enormously, higher education expanded enormously. So we got a lot, you know, basically it's highly skewed by income. And this is not simply explained by the highest income kids, say, having the best academic skills. This is organizing BA completion by low SES, high SES. And what you can see is in the low SES kids with the highest scores, just 41% of them are getting a BA, which is basically the same as for the mediocre rich kids. Okay, so we've got a system that is essentially replicating income when it comes to who's getting a BA. Now, can we fix this by one proposal I've seen in several of the papers? Make college free, and then therefore everything will get fixed, and we will have more people going to college. And indeed, tuition prices have tripled over time, but net of aid and for those low-income students, tuition prices really haven't changed much at all. So I'll jump through these quickly, but believe me when I say that basically the cost of attending college for the lowest income students has not been going up very much in recent years. So I'm just going to leave you with this figure up as I make my final points. The extensive margin as we've expanded college education in the US has been in very low quality schools. So we have not added to our Harvards, we have not added to our University of Michigans, we haven't really added to our universities of Massachusetts. Our expansion has been in the community colleges and in for-profit colleges. Both of these have extremely low graduation rates. And this is not just a US phenomenon, this has happened in other countries as well, where the college sector has expanded. It has done so not by adding more public capacity in terms of universities, but by letting the for-profit sector do it, and it's been an unmitigated failure in every country that's tried it. So it's not going to be the answer. The private sector is essentially not going to fix it. We need to build institutions, public institutions. So changing the price, smart students by themselves cannot get themselves a college education no matter how cheap it is. Manipulating the price is not going to do it. We need to build colleges that are good colleges that can train those students and then let them attend this. So this is a supply constraint. As opposed to a demand side constraint in terms of us getting more people into college. And it's not just at the college level. So what we're seeing from the evidence is that we can increase graduation rates, increase skills by improving the college's instruction, the institutions themselves. We can also do so by improving K-12 education. Why, that's even easier, of course, right? So what we have ahead of us, if we want to expand the population of skilled workers, is not manipulating prices, but improving government institutions through tax spending building. Thank you.
Okay. Eric?
So it's great to see these papers on this really important topic. I want to ask both Jeff and Susan about how things are different now than before. Both of you sort of looked at these historical series, but a lot of this conference is about how AI is different. I think David Otter is here, and he's talked about Polanyi's paradox, limiting what machines can do. Oh, there he is. And I've been saying more about the end of Polanyi's paradox in the past few papers, which is this idea, well, just to remind you, Polanyi's paradox is the idea that we all know more than we can tell, that it's hard for us to express and write down and codify things that we know about how to recognize a face or ride a bicycle. And that has, for most of history, put enormous constraints on what we can teach machines to do, because if you want to code, you have to codify, you have to be able to express what it is you want the machine to do. Of course, as we heard yesterday, we're seeing a new paradigm, machine learning, the end of good old-fashioned AI, where you had symbolic, or good old-fashioned programming, where you codified exactly what you wanted to do, and instead the machines are figuring out on their own not just how to play the game of Go, but how to have a data center that has 40% less cooling than any of the humans could figure out, or many other types of applications. So I wanted to hear from Jeff in particular about how you see that changing your model in terms of the role of educated people and education and putting the information in and see if those same trends should just be extrapolated, or if we're in a new era.
Okay, so we're going to collect questions and then get response. So next is Rebecca.
Jeff, my understanding is that there's some discussion about the declining labor share. You're showing that it varies by occupational classes, of course, interesting, but there's at least some argument that some of the decline in labor share is driven by political changes, changes in the tax regime, changes in our transfer policies, and so on. And I would like to invite you to speculate about the interaction between the dynamics that you identified and the political dynamics in which we currently find ourselves, and whether that increases or decreases the odds that we'll be owning the machines that are running the conference as we're having our cup of coffee.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to maybe double down on Eric's point, but be really specific about it and relate it to something Joel said yesterday that I thought was very important. So on the one hand, there's no doubt that in some sense, we in this room probably underestimate the degree to which the information technology revolution is now just hitting its stride, right? And so Eric's talked about that very articulately in many ways over many years, but that in some sense, we all experienced the IT revolution basically like 25 years ago, but it's only today that it's really washing over basically the great mass of jobs and activities in the economy. I think that it's really useful to distinguish that, I think, with Jeff's facts, as well as even the theory, and I think how you've been thinking about when you use the word robots, is really about automation. And that automation is a very direct consequence of the basic ability of digitization and the basic ability to do to basically set that up. I think that it's useful then to distinguish that from the very specific new thing that is multi-layered neural networks and their particular performance properties and the ability to predict against very disparate data sets. That, I think, at least I took away from yesterday as being at a much earlier stage. And so if you were in 1880, the real action in the economy was the coreless steam engine, not the electric motor yet. Even though Edison was kind of doing all this, we misattribute the 1880s as the age of electrification when it was in fact the age of the actually distributed steam engine. And I just think that that is a useful starting point, but very, very interesting.
So I thought the discussion about, Sue's discussion about education was interesting and great, and it relates to Jeff's points. I think something we have always been terrible at is the questions around, what specific educational skills should people be investing in? And maybe that's been kind of okay in that the BA for a long time has been the ticket to a pretty reliable ticket to the middle class lifestyle. And I don't know if we've been thinking enough about the question of whether changes in technology will lead to really big changes in the riskiness of educational investments, in that, some people are going to invest in skills that are just going to be the skills that are displaced, and other people are going to invest in the skills that turn out to be the skills that are slow to be displaced, and whether we have any previous attempt we have ever made to be good at this has been disastrous, but I'm curious whether we have anything we can say on that topic.
Two remarks about education. The first is that I think it's important to distinguish between the kind of educational forces that actually create the technological knowledge and those that teach the population how to cope with it and how to live with it. And on the former, I would say, most of these data don't matter because technological change is generated by a very small segment of the labor force. There's a whole literature now on this sort of upper tail human capital. And basically, within, 5 or 10% of the labor force, at most, probably less, most of this technological change that we are talking about is being created. The reason we should educate the rest is not because they're going to add all that much to artificial intelligence or machine learning or algorithm or anything like that, but they have to learn to cope with it. And there too, and here I'm undercutting the fact that I have been teaching at a university for over 40 years, I actually think universities probably don't matter very much. I have been totally persuaded by a range of work, all the way from David Barker to Jim Heckman and Janet Curry, that actually by age 6, it's essentially over. You know? That what you are going to become in life, what your capabilities are going to be, are almost entirely set by, in utero, early childhood, and very early education. And I just attended a talk that Jim gave, and the data really blow your mind. I mean, it really is quite amazing how powerful that effect is. So if we want to reallocate our resources, okay, we should probably not necessarily make sure that these curves keep going up. We should pump everything we have and give people access to the best health and educational conditions in the first 6 years of life.
Great. I want to give both Susan and Jeff a chance to respond. So maybe we'll start with Susan, and then Jeff will have the last word.
A good one to respond to at the very end there, right? The question, can we educate people, was essentially your question, right? So, and indeed, Heckman has a very firm opinion on this, and early childhood does matter a lot. The numbers that show how large the gaps are by socioeconomic status and how persistent they are through school is conditional on our current system, of course, which doesn't do a very good job of teaching low-income students. We have evidence from, strong evidence from a lot of that we can change that. So there are effective ways to improve education all the way through the pipeline, but they your pessimism should be about what our system is doing right now, and not about what any biological constraints are on the ability of people to learn or the distribution of skill.
Yeah, thank you. First, I think it's absolutely right to use a general category like automation as a replacement of labor by machines as a very broad category, and that has been going on at least since the spinning jenny, for example, which put a lot of spinners out of work, or agricultural machinery. So it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the digital age. Of course, with more sophisticated computer-controlled machinery and all of the cybernetics revolution, so-called, and the redesign of workflow, this linked more and more to the digital revolution. And that became quite intense in many manufacturing processes already by the 1960s, and certainly by the 70s and 80s. That's not artificial intelligence as we use it today, so I think it's really important to make those distinctions. Artificial intelligence, of course, is also a very broad concept, and the breakthroughs, as I understand it, really are the machine learning breakthroughs of the last 10 or 15 years, which are simply unbelievable and unexpected, in a sense, unexpected. That you can actually do language translation almost purely statistically without needing a linguist on your team. And that's a phenomenally great discovery. And there's obviously a lot that's going to come from that discovery that's extraordinarily rich. What does it mean? Certainly the most basic thing in my modeling context, it means a larger and larger swath of occupations will be replaced by machines. And that will have all of these ramifications for income distribution that I think are quite significant. And I'm very much of the view that we're in a big sweep of technology as a result of this. What will it mean for the future of jobs and education is, of course, what we're really talking about in this macro side of this issue. And when it comes to education, I would say a couple of things. One is that, as we just heard between Susan and Joel, I think the way to reconcile these different positions is early childhood development and growing up in a family environment where you are tended to, decent nutrition, low stress, good health care, and a loving household gives a lifetime of greater capacity, and those early years matter. But taking a high SES kid and saying, we're going to really treat you well for 6 years and then you're on your own, is not really conducive to good long-term labor market performance either. So I think it's more helpful when the parents help put the kid through their PhD program. So I don't see this really as a conflict between early childhood development and education. It does raise a big question, what kind of skills are needed? And there are two very different answers to that question, it seems to me. And Jan already hinted at one of them, which I very much believe. One is you could say, well, the boom really is STEM education. I mean, everyone should be coders. Probably not, for two reasons. One is there will be the supply response and then the incomes will go down. And probably coding is very much susceptible to actually these same forces. So the other kind of education is being human, because maybe what we're really going to be good at as complementary to the machines is that the machines will be machines and we'll be humans. And so actually learning things that are good for humans. Maybe the humanities will become the most profitable labor market activity because all the STEM stuff will be done in your little box. And what will really count is can you make a nice poem? Can you paint a nice picture? And can you be nicer to someone than the robot that's caring for them so that they want to be with you for a couple of hours, even though you're just a human being? My guess is humans will not be replaced on the human dimension by machines for a while, but maybe that's too optimistic too. If I'm waiting for the second season of Westworld, I don't know if it's out yet, but so far I'm persuaded that we still have a role, at least as humans, and that's probably what we should focus on. So we need some humanities in the training so that we remember what being human is about.